right. So I see that we've already got a pretty decent number of people coming in. We're right at the 2 o'clock mark, so I imagine there may be a couple more people joining. But for those of you who are new to the workshop series, or if you've just been enjoying them so far, so let me give you a little bit of an introduction about the series and how it came about. In early fall of 2020, the college created the Stanford Racial Justice Alliance, which was comprised of over 200 employees and student volunteers working together as one unified initiative with the goal of effecting positive change within the Tri-C community and throughout Greater Cleveland. The SRJ Alliance works to build upon the college's work in conflict resolution, social justice, and sustained dialogue to find meaningful ways to convene and engage our students, faculty, and staff, as well as the broader community, by developing college-wide events and activities and building in calls to action to eliminate systemic racism and social injustice. The Navigating a Polarized World series was developed to help students learn how to be objective and thoughtful consumers of information in an increasingly polarized society, as well as how to have productive conversations with individuals who may have differing or opposing views. And with that, let me turn it over to Dr. David Reynolds and Matthew Phillips for their presentation, Statues, Fascists, and Memory, the Use and Abuse of History.
All righty. So, yeah, you're welcome to stay up here with me if you want to go back and forth or if you want to sit off to the side. We're doing this hybrid again. So I want to thank the people who helped us set up just now, Raymond Anderson and Jackie Madison. We've done our previous events on one campus, and this time we are happily presenting from Western Campus on this beautiful Northeast Ohio day. And I'm so happy to see such a good turnout again. I'm going to go first. Professor Reynolds, Dr. Reynolds will go next, and then hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. All right. So what I want to start with, all right, is looking at that picture on the left. And I like to talk in a very interactive way. So if anybody just wants to put their microphones on and talk as we go, as long as there's not feedback and background noise, I actually like that sort of interactivity. All right. So what is going on in that picture on the left? Just shout out answers.
A man waving a Confederate flag.
Okay, so we have a woman up there on a flagpole.
A woman.
And waving makes it seem like this is a celebration, right? But does anybody recognize this photo or photos like this from the past few years?
Was this at something that kind of had to do with the Charleston event that happened 5 years ago with that like church thing where they had the Confederate flag and they're trying to kind of take it down?
Yeah, part of the Black Lives Matter movement, going back to Charleston, going through the George Floyd protests, and to today, there's been this interesting symbolic movement attached to it of taking down symbols of what element of America's past. That is what many regard as the Confederate flag. It was really just one of many battle flags experimented with over the years of the Civil War. But why I like to start with this is it just looks like, if you're looking at it without knowing any of the context, it's just some person taking down a flag. But this is really a challenge to a narrative that millions of Americans have been telling for the past 100+ years. All right. A lot of people, when they don't know the history of this, what's called the lost cause mythology, the idea that white Southerners have said that they were the good guys. Everybody always says they were the good guys, have this mythology about their cause. And a lot of people think, well, they just always thought that since the Civil War ended. But you actually have a construction of a story carried out by people and organizations like the Daughters of the Confederacy, especially between the 1890s and 1920s, to establish something called a Confederate flag that didn't actually really exist before in the way people understand it. Put up monuments. Those monuments have been coming down too, right? Right? Actually lobby textbooks and get white Southern ideas of the Civil War and slavery and everything attached to that into textbooks, into teaching children. Parades, rallies. This was huge, right? And 1890 to 1920 was the era when the white South was reasserting itself, right? After Northern troops had left, and really trying to put a different narrative out there, right? What you see on the right is even a descendant of Robert E. Lee taking part in one of these storytelling, myth-making, narrative-creating episodes back in 1907, all right? Lost cause myth is a myth because it does a number of things, and this is what I want to get into, all right? Usually when we think of myths, don't we think of like the Greeks, the Romans, fanciful stories, right? But humans, biologically, I'm going to step outside of just history for a second here, but humans are hardwired to be storytelling creatures. We look for meaning in everything, right? Everything we do, even the way we follow our sports teams, right? We say we, right? I can't believe, I'm sorry, I'm a Pittsburgher. I can't believe we tied the Lions the other day, right? And you're putting yourself into a story. You're putting yourself into a story as a character, right? And so any kind of identity group, whether you're looking at a religion, a race, a class, a sports fandom, you name it, there are stories told, memes shared, art viewed that does a number of things that I have up there alongside the bullet points. All right. Establish identity, right? Perhaps personal identity, but especially group identity. Who are we, right? This could be we as our nation, as a race, as a class, as a species. Every culture answers that question, all right? People also seek to have some sense of who they are in the universe and what the flow of time is. Like, is time moving forward from one era to another? Are things getting better? Is there a story of progress? Are things moving towards an end times, an apocalypse? Is time a circle? But every civilization does this. Every civilization does this. And what makes this stuff really powerful and really to the point of what Dr. Reynolds and I are going to talk about today is that from the way people construct these narratives, they establish and promote values. All right? What they see as good, what they see as bad, what they see as necessary or an unfortunate aspect of existence, right? But think of this like an author creating a story. Here's the setting, and here are the characters, but here's the plot. Here's how things develop over time, right? We do that with fiction, but we also do this with how we remember the past, right? And so I'm going to make a big distinction today between memory and history with a capital H, right? Memory, how a group constructs, remembers, makes a story out of the past. You put all those together, you also get an answer to one of the most profound human questions: what am I supposed to be doing here? Right? So if you say my people has this identity, time is moving forward in this kind of way, here's good, here's what's bad, here's what I should be doing, or here's what my culture should be doing. Right? I could really geek out on this, but I just want to use this as the premise. Right? So when we looked at this with the Confederates, you can see how creating a lost cause mythology does all of that, right? What does it mean to be in the community who has the lost cause, right? What is the course of history that led from the American Revolution to the American Civil War? The lost cause mythology would say that the white Southerners were actually carrying out a second revolution, right? What were their values? Almost everybody sees themselves as the good guys, right? And what was their mission? But it's easy to pick on the Confederates, right? Are we going to dismantle racism if we simply point out the Confederates and what they're doing wrong? No. All right. So before I get into that, I want to elaborate on it in this sense. When I say narrative, I'm just talking about the way a story is told, right? We create narratives so that we can actually reinforce our identities and all those things that I just got done talking about. One of the top signifiers to see if you're actually taking part in a narrative is if, when you're talking about the past, you say we, us, ours, right? Doesn't mean it's bad, because all humans have this innately. But it is a signal to you that, okay, I'm putting myself in this history that is immediately biasing me in one way or another. Right? And I think that's a key part of the navigating a polarized world set of lessons that we've been talking about over the past 2 weeks. Right? When you're researching history, and hopefully we can mention this a little bit later, you really got to put the focus on seeing everybody as they and them. They and them, not we and us. Right? When you create a narrative or a story out of the past, people become characters. The character of Robert E. Lee, a mythologized figure, not the real man. The character of Southern belles, right? You don't have separate names for different white Southern ladies. You just have this caricature, this character type of the Southern belle. And even the word slave is a character type. It's taking the humanity away from a person. It's saying, here's a character type called slave. And in the Lost Cause mythology, all kinds of things are attached to it that aren't really based in reality, right? Like a part of the family who was happy to be doing what we were doing, and X, Y, and Z, and they weren't unhappy until the North came down and told them they should do something different, all right? The tools, and I'm going to contrast this with real history later, the tools for constructing a narrative is based on some actual historical memory. It's not completely fictional, right? Nothing really ever is, but it comes out of belief, feelings. We talked about echo chambers last time. Dr. Derek Williams talked about echo chambers last time. We can have echo chambers when it comes to history. Do you hear about something in the past in such a way that it's comfortable with you and you're inclined to want to believe it and therefore you accept it? Or do you hear about something from the past and it challenges ideas that you hold to be true about existence, and therefore you get that cognitive dissonance and you want to say, no, that must not be true, all right? It's perpetuated in art, so TV shows, movies, statues, flags, symbols, right? And John, by the way, if you get any questions as we go and they fit the wavelength I'm on in the moment, feel free to just jump right in, all right? Anything so far?
Only thing so far is Leo from OSU was pointing out that you're looking at everyone as they is a really fascinating point. So,
and it's a hard
yeah.
thing to do because it's innate to attach yourself to things. I mean, if you don't attach yourself to things, you're like floating listlessly in the universe, and that's scary, right?
Mhm.
So it's almost like you have to switch modes, right? Like, okay, I recognize that I'm putting myself into a story. You know, like I think Dr. Williams brought up football last time. Like, if I'm watching my Steelers play and I'm watching in the mindset of this is us, this is we, the referees are always wrong, right? But if I take a step back and go, okay, here's one team, here's another team, they and they, then I'm automatically more neutral and understand things a little bit more clearly. So you can't toss aside your humanity at all, but you should be able to switch modes, right? With that being said, this is why I say it's easy to pick on the Confederates, all right? I imagine everybody who's attending today is like, okay, I easily see the construction of the lost cause idea as a myth that perpetuates what white Southerners wanted to see as reality. But even the way the Civil War is remembered for many people in the North has elements of mythology. And it has to. Otherwise, we wouldn't have racism as an issue in the North as well. And of course, if you look at where a lot of these protests are taking place, it's the North, right? One of the most pervasive myths that Northerners and a number of Southerners held about slavery, and this is something that critical race theory brings up, which is now just a wide body of all kinds of different ideas that have been tossed together on under one label called critical race theory. The 1619 Project is that you don't have slavery without capitalism. Northerners, though, following the Civil War, they wanted to tell the history of the United States as one of progress based on democracy, free markets, and told themselves that slavery was not part of that. It was an aberration. It wasn't part of how America worked. It's this random thing that Southerners did, and of course it was going to go away eventually. But if you look at data, every decade of the 1800s up until the Civil War in the 1860s, slavery expanded as an economic institution in the United States in terms of number of people enslaved, in terms of the portion of the economy that was devoted to or connected to slavery, in terms of America's international trade, dealing with raw materials above all cotton generated in the South. And Northerners were completely part of this. It was Northern capital investing in cotton textiles. It was Northern shipping that was involved, right? Northerners were so heavily invested in this, but hey, they're the good guys in the Civil War, and we know that the Confederates are the bad guys, so let's just say that slavery was entirely on them. That is a myth, and it's one that gets in the way, because if you think slavery was just about white Southerners, it doesn't help you fix most of the racial disparities that we have nowadays. A lot of the racial disparities that we have nowadays come from that interconnecting of capitalism and discrimination. All right. So you always got to look for, like, okay, I'm a Northerner. I say, yeah, hell yeah, we won the Civil War. Not going to argue that that's a bad perspective, but still realize that that might be affecting what you assume to be true about the past. And it might be getting in the way of actual analysis. By the way, I don't have a clock on me, so if I do go a little long, just kind of, Reynolds is next to me. I'm giving him permission to just kind of reach out and smack me across the face if I'm talking too much. All right. So that's just to reinforce. It's a slide we've already seen. All right. This could be an entire class period, but I just want to mention some of the big American narratives. If you talk to the author Neil Gaiman, he would call these our American gods. All right. Americans live and breathe the notion that this thing called progress is real. That every generation things progress. That starting in 1776, Americans picked up the torch and are leading the way towards bringing humanity ever more forward, right? And if it involves fighting people who are lost in the darkness, that's seen as a necessary evil for an ultimate good, right? That is a very pervasive mythology that you see not only in paintings like that, but even in things like Star Trek, right? Even in all kinds of ways that people just talk nowadays, is that progress is a scientifically viable word rather than a concept that includes values. Another big one is the melting pot. Does somebody want to chime in and say what they think the melting pot refers to? This is my chance to get a break from trying to breathe through this mask. Sean, go ahead, unmute yourself. Sean's a member of our history club at Metro.
It's kind of like that time period when, or kind of the theme that like different like groups of people from all over the world came into America for kind of a different lifestyle. You had people coming from like Africa, you had people coming from Latin America, you had people coming from Europe, and some even coming from Asia.
And there's this idea that this is a repeating story that takes place every generation in America. That whether you're looking at when Italians and Polish people were coming across to Ellis Island in the 1910s, or if you're looking at people coming up from Central America and Mexico right now, or the Irish way back in the 1840s, the idea that it's almost a rite of passage to gaining that American identity, that you leave some troubled old land, you make a tough voyage over here, you don't have all the privileges when you show up, but you work hard, and then your children inherit the American dream. All right? And that's a story that we as Americans want to believe is true. And we like to believe it's true, and like to believe that it's a part of a unique sort of American nationalism that welcomes in outsiders, lets them become Americans, and lets some of their old culture melt into the American whole. That's a story. That's a story. Whether it's true or not is beside the point. It's just a story. And then you also have very closely connected to that the American dream. That, okay, maybe not everybody's exactly equal, but if you believe the ideology, everybody has equal opportunity. And if they work hard in a democracy and a capitalistic system, then they will be able to better themselves, right? That's an idea. That's not something out of the social sciences backed up by data or anything like that. It's a belief. It's a thing that animates people's existences, right? And I'm sure if you think back, you can find many other American narratives, right? So this is where we get to matters that are very closely connected to the stand for racial justice, right? And I know time is short, so I'm just going to abbreviate some of this. But if you listen to most Americans who don't really know much about, like white Americans who really don't know much about the history of race, the history of civil rights, any of that kind of stuff, who's the one civil rights figure that they do talk about?
Dr. King.
Yeah, Dr. King.
Okay.
An amazing human being, but how much depth is understood about Martin Luther King? His ideology, his thoughts, the different movements he led. Doesn't it always come down to one speech? What's the one speech? Taylor?
I have a dream.
Yeah, what's the dream? I have a dream that
we would all be equal.
yeah, that white kids and black kids will be together as equals. Not that they erase their racial identities or anything like that, but that they will coexist happily, right? That's really just one step away from the melting pot and American dream pair of ideas, right? You see that shown in very 20th century American painter Norman Rockwell with the New Kids in the Neighborhood, 1967. And the thing with King is that in the American national mythology, we've turned him into a mythological figure, right? You even see one Orthodox church even puts the halo behind his head. You get a holiday, and absolutely deserving of those things, but it also simplifies our understanding of him and his message. Because now we've put it into a pre-existing narrative of Americans melt together, Americans have access to equal opportunity, and America always progresses every generation, right? Of course, there were people involved in the civil rights movement, including King himself in the 50s, but especially the 60s and after his assassination into the early 70s, who said, you know, I don't think this melting is exactly happening, right? You even have King himself says the people who most get in the way of progress are the white moderates who think they're actually on the right side, right? You get movements like from the Black Panthers, Nation of Islam, who take that we language and they say, forget the melting pot. We've never been allowed to melt, so let's embrace taking care of ourselves. For us, by us business models, right? Separate national anthem, providing city services that are separate from the official city services, like breakfast programs provided by the Black Panthers, right? And of course, we're often taught that a lot, like Middle America feared the Black Panthers because of the guns and the berets. But there was also a challenge to the national story. That somehow within America's borders, there can be two we's. There's this group, there's that group, and no melting. No melting, right? And I think that trips up a lot of Middle America even right now, right? I'm a good guy because I want them to be part of this story that I believe in, right? But in a way that asks people to erase identity, erase their story of themselves and their people. Don't have time to get into it, but I just love that picture on the bottom left / hate it. Because it's just showing you how strong some of these feelings were in the 60s about embracing division and putting aside the melting pot. That this is a 1960 Nation of Islam meeting in which 3 leading members of the American Nazi Party showed up. Obviously, they weren't very comfortable there, like you can see in the picture, but they thought they agreed on one thing: embrace division. Honestly, I just found this out yesterday. The most uncomfortable person at that meeting was the photographer, who was a a woman, and both of those groups were very patriarchal, and Jewish. Yeah. All right. For the sake of time, I'm not going to play this video, but Dr. Williams mentioned James Baldwin last time. This is a very compelling, just 3-minute long video where he dissects the N-word. And what he points out is exactly on the wavelength of this talk, that that is a word that white people created to account for feelings they had about self-hatred, the powers that they had over other people. The phrase in terms of what I put up on the screen earlier, it's a character type that's put into a story. That once before the Civil War, you had a character type called slave. And continuing long after the Civil War, you have this idea that there is a type of American who is this character type. All right? It's a really deep abstract wavelength, but hopefully you can let that percolate in the back of your heads as we move on. All right. And David, how are we doing on your time? Yeah, we're fine. Okay. So these are just my last couple slides, and then I'm also going to let John pinch hit for me on my last slide. All right. So what I did on this slide is that left column is what you've already seen before. The right column now contrasts that with learning actual history. All right. So mythology on the left, history on the right. If mythology and all that identity stuff is about making a story out of the past, the study of history is analysis, understanding how changes developed over time. Yes, you should have emotion in there because you should care about your research, but then as you do your research, you got to be aware of your own biases and push it off to the side, right? Above all, I think, and maybe you have a different perspective here, but you analyze the past so that you can see how systems came into being. And so you can see patterns. We have cliches like history repeats itself, or we got to learn or else we'll repeat the same mistakes. Those are sort of cliches, but they are on their wavelength, right? With the pronouns, if you're doing real history, it's always they, them, and theirs, all right? If people are characters, like the mythological figure of Robert E. Lee when you're doing narrative, people, when you're actually analyzing history, are agents, meaning that they have free will. They were humans who lived, breathed, probably died. Human emotions, their feelings and attitudes change over time. And they're not simple. They don't represent an ideal. They represent all the complexity of what it means to be a human being, right? The tools, and this is where one of the areas where critical race theory, 1619 project, ruffles feathers. It's not just with saying, okay, if you question America's racial history, you're also questioning its democracy and its capitalism, but also you have to embrace revision, right? The narrative view says, here's a story, and I want to believe that story, and I want to tell that story to my kids, and I want their kids to tell it to their kids the same way, right? History, it's oddly like science, in that in science, if you have a hypothesis or a theory, your job is not to prove that hypothesis or theory. Your job is actually to try to disprove it. And the same is true if you're doing research in history. I think this analysis is correct. Let's see how it might be wrong. People are looking for stories to give them meaning. That's uncomfortable, right? That's uncomfortable. But if you're really researching the past, you've got to be willing to question everything based on research and logic, based on sources. And there's never going to be an answer key. There's always going to be new interpretations, right? So if you have questions for me, save them to the very end. Just make sure we have time for everybody. But as we transition, Dr. Reynolds, as I was talking to John, he mentioned, first of all, like we were talking about where news sources fit into this. And then he also said, well, also the way we share a lot of our historical ideas nowadays are through memes. So just to connect to Professor Williams' talk last time, before I get to you, John, one thing I was thinking of is where do news sources fit into this? Because we talked a lot last time about bias in news. And, you know, the days of Walter Cronkite, when you had a national American news that reflected all kinds of different American viewpoints, right? But nowadays, I mean, American news, that's already defining it for an audience. Here's spinning the story for an American audience. But just to say in passing that now we have very demographically defined news sources. People from this political party who mostly read or watch this, people from this one who mostly read or watch this. You have racially defined, you have ethnically defined, you have really in this world where there's so many people putting news out there, all right? They're putting it out there for a specific audience, and that alone will inherently shape the narrative. How do we present this news for that community and their belief system? Even yours. You can't escape it, right? And so in the world of memes, as we transition, John, you can take this one.
Okay, so the reason why I had shared this particular meme, and there are a couple of versions of this floating around out there with Matt, there are people who I either are or were friends with on Facebook that shared this over the years. I believe all of them were from West Virginia, which ironically actually joined the North. But you know, it's this kind of fake narrative, right? Trying to you know, make one side look benevolent or awesome. And you know, if you're looking at this really big version of the meme here, you can see on the right-hand side where it says WSTCF. Anybody have any idea what that stands for? We support the Confederate flag. There's actually a group out there that basically like put their brand on this. And you know, how many people see this and immediately like the hair on the back of your neck stands up? It just makes you profoundly uncomfortable to see it, right? So, you know, you typically have a couple of different reactions to this. You can either see it and unfriend someone, or see it and just like start chewing the person out, but that doesn't really help to address the problem, right? So one of the things that I would argue is all of our responsibility is that when we see things like this, we try and actually pick it apart and try and show how things like this are inaccurate or how they're false. So, you know, for example, the very first part of that, the over 620,000 white people died. Anybody know how many people died in the Civil War? Like, that number is actually pretty accurate. But as soon as you get to the word white people, there were black soldiers in the Civil War, right? So already you're erasing an entire part of the demographic that participated in the war. And was the Civil War always about freeing slaves? No, no. I mean, originally it was just about getting the South to rejoin the Union. So you know, there's a lot of different pieces and parts of memes like this that, like how Matt was saying, if you step back and look at it as they them and not, you know, them and us. If you actually take a minute and step away, leave, you know, your anger and your biases at the door, and actually try and pick apart these things and find those holes, you know, you've got an option of responding to a meme like this in a way that maybe might change the mind of the person that posted it, but at the very least, the other people who are going to see that meme would at least see a comment that disproves a lot of it. So, you know, there are various ways that, you know, we as consumers of information can push back against things like this. So, you know, just kind of food for thought to throw out there as we move forward.
And just if I can say real quickly, I'm pretty sure 620,000 is closer to the total number counting both sides.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's erroneous. And just that even though the words we and they aren't in there, you can see that we and they thinking is implied. We're known as this. Nobody's thanking us. So even though those words aren't there, they are in the background. It is we and they thinking.
Yeah, and Leo made a really good point. Troubled by this meme because of the assumption that black people should thank white people for freeing them when they should never have been enslaved.
Yeah. Thank you, John.
Yeah.
And David, I believe you're up. You want me to switch over?
Yeah.
You could.
Now, we're gonna start. All right. In case anyone doesn't know, I'm Dr. Reynolds, David Reynolds. My area of research and scholarship is Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, although I do keep track of far-right groups in the United States for obvious reasons. So I'm going to kind of incorporate a little bit of all of that. And one of the things I've noticed in the last few years, especially the last year, misuse of terms like fascism, socialism, communism, liberalism, and even conservatism. So we'll call it, this is the Statute of Fascist Memory and Use of History. So I'm going to start at the same place. The Robert Lee statue and the protests in Charlottesville. And as you notice here, the marchers, it was the Unite the Right, so the disparate group of neo-Confederates, neo-Nazis, various other militia groups, which the Patriot groups, the Patriot movement have historically for decades been far right. They all tend to have a certain, they identify as Christian and they also identify as white supremacists, even if they don't use that term. What struck me as a scholar of Nazi Germany with this torch march is, of course, the Nazis did the same thing. We're seeing torch marches from the far right all over Europe today, in Hungary, in Germany, and other parts of Eastern Europe. It's something that the Nazis had done. This was deliberate in the marches in Charlottesville. One, they decreed that only men march, and we have all this in video, that only men march with the torches. They shouted things like, "You will not replace us." They shouted "blood and soil," which is a Nazi reference. The idea that a racial group is tied to the land. Their blood is tied to the land. So the idea is that America is white land for white people. They also said the Jews will not replace us. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but that's something in the far right, racist right, referred to as the replacement, the white replacement theory. So we'll get to that. Sorry. Why is this happening?
It was working oddly for me,
So
let me do it over here, maybe.
yeah, just do one more.
Can you click off the, just anywhere in the right area? There we go.
Okay. About the only good thing I could say that came out of the Unite the Right in Charlottesville was we get to see the Confederate flag, the Nazi flag, together as white supremacist movements. That's what they are. They are symbols of white supremacy. They are symbols of hate. You can also see the Gadsden flag there. For years, that's been the flag of libertarians, right and left. It's also being used now by more right-wing neo-fascist type groups. And so this is kind of what I want to explore. I don't know why it's not working.
Can you click in the right area?
Okay. All right, so I have more words in this presentation than I normally use, but I'm doing it for a reason. So let's start with this idea of fascism. That's being thrown around by both the right and the left, but in different ways and often erroneously. So fascism developed in the immediate years after World War I. World War I created a sense of ultra-nationalism. Sometimes was based on race, sometimes was not based on race. It was started by Benito Mussolini, former socialist, who because of the war became an ardent nationalist and eventually a fascist, since he's the one who really coined the term. Fascist comes from the Roman fasci. It was a bundle, essentially a bundle of sticks that the praetors would carry into the Roman Senate. And those bundles of sticks represented law and order, that those laws bind us together as a people and create stability and order. Mussolini wanted to basically, in his movement, recreate the glories of ancient Rome. And it's kind of that mythology we're talking about of the past. I'll come back to that. So fascism comes from the fasci of Mussolini's fascist combat league, that he called it. Now the core beliefs, and this is based on an entry, a fascism entry I wrote for the Berkshire Encyclopedia of World History many, many years ago. So I kind of adapted it from that. Anti-liberalism, anti-socialism, anti-communism, anti-internationalism, today we would use the term globalism, and anti-democratic. Those are all connected by the sense that the rejection of the Enlightenment liberal democratic notion that all humans are created equal and have equal rights. That is what is rejected by fascism. The belief is that all people are not created equal, and for many fascists, especially the Nazis, all races are not created equal. And so the idea, democracy gives power to the less worthy, as would communism, socialism, liberalism. So all of this, if you're an ultra-nationalist, you're by definition anti-international or global. You remember Trump's nationalist speech when Trump said, I'm a nationalist, these globalists, I love my country, globalists don't love their country. Well, that's just simply not true. It's just looking at your country as part of a global system. I mean, we'll never deal with climate change if we only look at ourselves as single nations. And so that's the core of the fascist movements that arose in the violence, the post-war violence of World War I. A lot of that was engendered by the success of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. It frightened many in Europe and the United States, created a Red Scare. There was a brief communist uprising in Berlin in 1918, in Munich in Germany in 1919, and there was one in Hungary as well after the war. None of them were successful except for the Soviet version, but it was enough to frighten a lot of people towards the right. Fascists tend to believe, and a lot of this will apply today, that the modern world is decadent and degenerate, both culturally and biologically. Modern art is rejected, modern music is rejected, and this notion that miscegenation, the sexual relations between different racial groups leads to degeneration. And so you needed a pure race through various kinds of eugenic measures as well as laws, anti-miscegenation laws. Fascist movements tend to believe that there's a need for what I'll call redemptive violence. They have an aura of themselves as chosen ones, often chosen by divine forces, God, to purge or cleanse the world of the degenerating forces, which were usually termed either communists, liberals, and especially for the Nazis, Jews. The communists, liberals, and Jews are deliberately doing things to degenerate the world to the point of apocalypse, of destruction of the world. If that redemptive violence is successful, that would lead in turn to a restoration of a mythic golden past, these mythic narrative stories that we're talking about, and also usher in a glorious new age. So it's kind of a mythic view of the past combined with a mythic view of the coming future. For the Nazis, it was the millennial Third Reich, the 1,000-year Reich, which is actually a reference to the millennial kingdom of John in Revelation. And so fascists were searching for what they called a third way. They wanted to keep the ultra-nationalism, my country before everything. But they also were worried about workers, who were the bulk of society around the world. Marx had said famously, proletarians, workers of the world, unite. And the idea is if most of the world, 90% of the world are workers, if they unite, they can change the world and they can control the world for the better. Fascists, since they're anti-communist, didn't really know quite what to do with that. As Marx is trying to raise class consciousness among workers to lead to a classless society eventually, what the fascists do is promote national consciousness, and especially in the case of the Nazis, race consciousness. And so their idea of appeasing workers is give them a better life, better working conditions, better housing conditions. For Hitler, the whole point of the people's car, the Volkswagen, was so working class people would have a car. It's not just something that rich people would have. And so the idea is we don't want to lose workers to the Marxists, the Bolsheviks, so we can win them by stressing that it doesn't matter what you do for a living. If you're a worker, middle class, lower class, working class, or upper class, it matters that you're a citizen of the nation or of a specific race. So as they search for this third way, they often use terms like national syndicalism, national corporatism, They even looked at National Bolshevism, but as news came out of Russia during the Civil War, how bad it was, that term was not going to fly. So some of them started working with the term National Socialism. And even before the Nazis grabbed onto this term. National Socialism, we also call it Nazism. That comes from their title, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. When you see National Socialism, this is something I see a lot today, even in Congress. When you see the term National Socialism or the National Socialist German Workers' Party, you think, well, the Nazis are actually left wing. They're socialists. And I have an example if we get to it later. That's not true. What Hitler meant by socialism is that it doesn't matter, again, it doesn't matter what you do for a living, it matters that you're a racial German, you're an Aryan. And so that's what he's talking about. So the Nazis are far, far right. They're as far right as you can go. It really has very little to do with what we would concern as nationalism. And I'll give you some examples as we pass this up. So here's my example here. Mo Brooks, Republican from Alabama. He's one of the Congress people who's being investigated for his role in the January 6th insurrection. He gave a speech on the floor of the House, March 25th, 2019, and he misuses the term socialist. He says, if socialists in the fake news media, we'll come back to that, had any honor, they would cleanse. And anytime I see people use the word cleanse, I really worry. People usually die when you talk about cleansing and purging. But he says that they would cleanse their souls and atone for their sins. In that vein, he says, I quote another socialist who mastered the big lie to a maximum deadly effect. So Mo Brooks is saying that the mainstream media essentially is putting out a big lie about things like the election and et cetera. The words in yellow are actually the words that he then quotes from this socialist. That in the big lie, there's always a certain force of credibility because the broad masses of the nation. And thus, in the primitive simplicity of their minds, they more readily fall victim to the big lie than the small lie. And it would never come into their heads to fabricate colossal untruths, and they would not believe that others could have have the impudence to distort the truth so infamously. And so he's quoting this. He doesn't say who this socialist is. Well, I put in the rest, you don't have to worry, but the rest of that text actually is an attack on the media, an attack on the Jews, and it came from this one. No, I want to go next. There we go. He was quoting Mein Kampf. Now, obviously, his mistake is Hitler is not a socialist. He's a national socialist. He's far right. He's right wing. He's not left wing. And this was a diatribe against the fake news of the time, and we'll come to this. But the Nazis said that all the reporting from traditional newspaper was fake news. The Jews are behind it. And so the Nazis created their own paper, which I'll show some of their own publications, what we'll see in a second. So here's someone accusing the left of something that really was coming from the right. So we see that. Oops, let me go back one.
David,
right.
Did anyone call him out on the socialist versus national socialist screw up?
Not when he did it, because a lot of people don't realize that. But I'd be surprised how many times I've heard people say, "Well, the Nazis were socialists, but it's National Socialism." And if you don't know your history, that actually, that makes sense that you would think that. But if you've had any historical insight into Nazi Germany, you realize that's not true. The Nazis hated socialists. They banned the Socialist Party. They put them in concentration camps. They put communists in concentration camps. They put union leaders in concentration camps. The Nazis were as far right as you could get. But it becomes convenient for people to call each other, and this happens on both sides. I focus on the right because that's my focus in my research. But both sides often misuse the term fascist. And what people are usually, what they mean is tyranny. And tyranny is not necessarily fascism. You can have communist tyranny from the far left, and you can have Nazi tyranny from the far right. That has nothing to do with socialism per se, or even necessarily communism. And so people just use the term fascist if they think someone's being tyrannical. And we'll get to the whole vaccine stuff that's been happening recently. July 3rd, 2020 at Mount Rushmore, the former president gave a speech where he said this: in our schools, our newsroom, even our corporate boardrooms, there's a new far left fascism. There's no such thing. There's simply no such thing as far left fascism that demands absolute allegiance. If you do not speak its language, perform its rituals, recite its mantras, and follow its commandments, then you will be censored, banished, blacklisted, persecuted, and punished. And in part, he personalizes everything. So he's talking about himself as he's getting kicked off Facebook and social media for spreading distortions and lies. He somehow sees that as somehow persecution. And a number of his supporters still say that. But he goes on, make no mistake, this left-wing cultural revolution is designed to overthrow the American Revolution. There's no truth in it, of course, but let's go on. In so doing, they would destroy the very civilization that rescued billions from poverty. I don't know who he's talking about. Disease, violence, and hunger, and that lifted humanity to new heights of achievement, discovery, and progress. A lot of myths right there, American myths. To make this possible, they are determined to tear down every statue, this brings us back to the Charlottesville, symbol in memory of our national heritage. And so again, he's looking at current events through this mythic lens, and projecting onto essentially liberals a far-right fascism that many in the left actually would attribute more to him. Okay. So let's get a few more of these and we'll go through these. I've collected over 4,000 far-right emails over the last couple of years, and they just pop up in my email far more than I get anything from the Democratic Party or liberal groups. They just kind of replicate and they come out and they come out. And one of the things I've noticed that I started getting a lot of gun emails. These are all generated by automated email bots, essentially. But here's one from Blabberbuzz. I'm using Blabberbuzz because they're the most notorious that I've been coming across. Fascism USSA. Now the USSA is actually a reference to the USSR, so the two don't make it. It doesn't make any sense to put fascism and essentially communism together. But it says Biden's FBI using Gestapo tactics, and all Americans should worry. Well, that's a reference to the FBI using warrants to look into the leader of Project Veritas, who had gotten their hands on Joe Biden's granddaughter or his daughter's diary. It was during the election. It was done actually to affect the election. So it actually is a federal issue. And they used warrants. The Gestapo did not use warrants. So there's nothing Gestapo about that. The next one, Pelosi has turned FBI into her, these are actual headlines. Pelosi has turned FBI into her own personal Gestapo, legally spying on GOP House members. That's simply in reference to the committee that's investigating January 6th. And they want to know, because there's indications that there are certain Congress people who were in fact involved in the planning. They were in the meetings, they knew about it, et cetera, et cetera. There's nothing Gestapo about that. What about AOC? The right hates her. Gestapo Sandy. AOC has been sounding more like Stalin and Hitler than a U.S. representative. These are actually generated to have effect just with the headlines. I bet most people who see them don't even click on it. If you click on it, there's very little information. This was simply a story where AOC was saying, well, Biden, I disagree with Biden. He thinks with Trump gone, the Republican Party is going to get back to its natural conservative roots. And she said, I don't think that's going to be the case. Now, there's nothing in that statement that sounds like Stalin or Hitler. The other one, socialists secretly introduced biblical mark of the beast, digital cash legislation to reset your wealth to zero. This I got 3 in a row from 3 different gun emails. You can see those there. This was simply, they were talking about coming up with kind of a digital wallet for Americans that cash could be put in. Miami's starting to do this. A lot of cities, a lot of countries are doing this kind of thing. It's nothing nefarious, but much of the American far right, especially the Christian far right, is obsessed with revelation. And they're always looking for things where people are trying to mark us in some way, even with vaccines with microchips in them or something stupid like that. One last one, the Nazi era began with exactly the same tactic that the Lincoln Project and the Dems are using here. Well, one thing, the Lincoln Project is actually Republican, George Conway. The Dems actually were not involved in this thing. And this was simply a project where the Lincoln Project is going to keep a list of people who worked with Trump for, I guess, retribution purposes, but that's one part of the Republican wing going after another part of the Republican wing, and it has nothing to do with the Nazis. So people use fascism, Nazi, Gestapo for a certain effect, even though it has nothing to do with it. Let's take this misuse into the world of vaccine and masks. A lot of people who are anti-mask, anti-vaccine see mandates as somehow being fascist or Nazi-like, even though with the Supreme Court early in the 20th century okayed vaccine mandates. I have the mark for polio over here. I had that when I was a kid. I've had probably a dozen vaccines over the years. Nothing nefarious, nothing terrible about it. Kids need to get vaccines to go to school in public schools. It's been here for decades. This is not a fascist project. But you see it here, this kind of meme on the left coming out of a right-winger in Hollywood where it says vote red, vote Republican, and a swastika made out of syringes. The idea is this person's, in their mind, they're not supporting Nazism, but they're saying vaccine mandates are Nazi-like. That's a big problem, and especially since, let me bring it in here, it's from my own research. This is from the Nazi propaganda machine that shows an Aryan woman with her Aryan child and a supposed Jewish doctor vaccinating her. Aufordnung der Impfung, vaccination order. And so this idea that a vaccine mandate is somehow Nazi-like is just historically wrong. But notice two in a row say mask Nazis. Pelosi introduced a step to find a penalty for not wearing a mask properly in Congress. Mask Nazis. Toddlers are feeling the wrath of government overreach in Michigan just to have kids wear masks in school. American fascism. White House telling Facebook which post to center. This is the idea that misleading vaccine and posts should be removed by these media organizations. There's nothing fascist about that. Leftism is bringing down Americans' willingness to fight real fascism. If you click on this, this was about a survey that was looking at people through American wars, through history. What wars should we have been involved in, not involved in, based on percentages, and it had to do with World War II. It really has nothing to do with what it's talking about. Do a little bit more here with Marjorie Taylor Greene's misuse of Nazi history. Well, let's show her timeline. I won't go through all of them. I'm deliberately using some of the most notorious for the very reason that, and I try to explain this in my classes, before the Great Depression hit in 1929, the Nazis never got more than 3% in the national vote. The Great Depression hit, there was a second Red Scare, and all of a sudden the Nazis are getting over 30% of the vote. And in the parliamentary system, if they could form a coalition with other conservatives, they could form a government, and that's how they ended up taking power. Here is Marjorie Taylor Greene on the right with 3%ers. You can see the badge of the 3%ers. That's another historical myth, that the patriots who started the American Revolution were only 3% of the society. That's not true. American colonists were very split on whether or not the American Revolution should go forward, but it was not 3%. So that's another myth, that a small group of patriots could lead a revolution. These are the same people that were involved in the insurrection with Oath Keepers and others. So just, again, don't try to read all these. I'm going to focus on the top one the most. On November 17, 2018, she claimed that the Rothschild family, and I'll come back to why that's important in a second, family used space lasers to start and profit from California wildfires. I mean, it's absurd, it's laughable, but the problem is the Nazis believe similar absurd things. They believe that Jews created capitalism and communism to take over the world. There's no truth to any of that. The Nazis believed so we have to take absurd beliefs seriously. I'm going to move down to another one. She appeared to invoke a debunked conspiracy theory about liberal megadonor George Soros. I'll come back to him, who's Jewish, that he was a Nazi collaborator. The Nazi himself tried to continue what was not finished. The idea that George Soros, a Jewish billionaire who's donated billions of dollars to fight communism and to fight fascism, is absurd. He was a young man in Hungary, first when it was a Nazi controlled, and then when it was controlled by the communists. So he's devoted his life to trying to promote democracy, and somehow that makes him a demon on the right. Let's skip down. Let me go down to May 22nd. She said on a podcast that Nazi gas chambers and yellow stars were forced upon Jews in Nazi Germany as a force of vindication. Exactly the same type of abuse as mass mandates. That's for someone who teaches the subject of the Holocaust. That's incredibly offensive. That's incredibly offensive. The Nazi deliberate murder of 6 million Jews has nothing to do with wearing a mask to prevent the spread of disease. So it's offensive and it's historically inaccurate. She said vaccine verification measures in supermarkets and colleges were Nazi practices. At a Matt Gaetz rally, she said the Nazi Party was officially the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and therefore just like the Democratic Party, which is now a National Socialist Party. Again, completely inaccurate, wrong. And then the end of the last one, she says the Biden administration plans to launch a door-to-door vaccine information, which there was talk about doing that as Nazi paramilitary groups. She said, quote, we don't need your medical brown shirt showing up at our door. And again, she's not the only one who said this. Even Josh Mandel, who's running here, he's a survivor. He's actually the descendant of Holocaust survivors. His family not only funded the Mandel Scholars Program here, but they're a big funder of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, as well as Holocaust Center in Arizona, one of the universities. He said, when the Gestapo comes to your door, you know what to do. I don't know how his family deals with Thanksgiving with him, but anyway, those are all inaccurate. I want to come back to the Rothschild reference in case you don't know the history of anti-Semitism. This was a picture. This political cartoon was created for the Daily Stormer, which is named after the Nazi anti-Semitic rag, the Stormer. And it shows, if you look at the very top, well, actually, we'll start at the bottom. It's McMaster, Generals McMaster and Petraeus, when they decided to push back on some of Trump's actions. They are now seen as puppets of George Soros, again, who's a Jewish billionaire. And then the master puppet at top is the Rothschilds. The Rothschild reference goes back to the 19th century, to the Rothschild banking family. They became a symbol of a Jewish attempt supposedly to control the world. It's a myth, it's a fantasy, but here it is over 100 years later still being used. For the far right, the hope was that Trump would be the savior. Here Trump is mythologized as a cowboy. The son is the Fourth Reich, pulling back the Zionist curtain. The name Goldberg, my brother-in-law is Goldberg. Notice the D and the R. For many in the far right, both the Democrats and the Republicans are a problem. The Democrats because they're liberals and therefore degenerate, but the Republicans for not going far enough. And offensively at the bottom under Ben Garrison's name, it says Happy Kristallnacht, November 9th. We just had the anniversary of Kristallnacht when the Nazis burned and looted synagogues and murdered and detained thousands of German Jews. Let's move on. Get off of her. This goes down a little bit here, but I came across this doing research, and this was from a presentation I did for the ADL. But it says, who are the Jews? We invented communism. Marx was Jewish, but he was secular, and it had nothing to do with being Jewish. We are behind radical feminism. We are behind multiculturalism. We are behind anti-Christianity. We want a one-world government. Race baiters, slave traders. It goes on. The ACLU, the ADL, the NAACP, Southern Poverty Law Center. We are MSM, mainstream media, Hollywood, et cetera, et cetera. We are anti-gun, open borders, et cetera, et cetera. We are the eternal radical. The danger is, we can say, okay, this is Nazi-like anti-Semitism, which it is. But when you look at all those things that Jews are being accused of, it's very much become the rhetoric of the American right. And so in many cases, they don't say Jew, they just say liberal. But the accusations are the same. And they can be quite murderous. I want to play a little clip, and let's see if this is going to work. This is Richard Spencer. If you don't know, he founded the term alt-right. He's a white supremacist. He's a neo-Nazi. He tries to claim he is not. He was one of the people who thought we need to get away from skinheads because it doesn't attract a movement. So wear suits and that kind of thing. Let's see if this works. This is a speech that he gave a week or so after Trump was elected in 2016.
Are you guys here, man?
No.
If it doesn't work, I can paraphrase it.
Yeah, I think it has to do with how they did the setup.
Okay. All right, so forget that. But he gave a speech again. This is about 10 days after, in Washington, D.C., about 10 days after Trump was elected. He started off by saying, Heil Trump, Heil Victory. Or he said, Hail Trump, Hail Victory, which is, of course, the Nazi slogan, Heil Hitler, Sieg Heil. And so he started off with a direct Nazi reference in response to the election of Trump, which he was ecstatic for. He talked about the mainstream media, and he took him aside and he said, "Oh, we should refer to the mainstream media in the original German Lügenpresse." And the Lügenpresse is what the Nazis called the legitimate press during their time. The Lügenpresse means the lying press. And you get a sense of it here. Oops. Need to click to the next. Let me click to the next. Please work. Okay. So anyway, he referred to white people. He said America's a white nation created by white people for white people, ignoring the indigenous people and everyone else who's not white who built this country. He referred to white Americans as children of the sun, which is a Nazi reference. This was the Stormer, which this is the rag that inspired the Daily Stormer. We saw those cartoons, and it's called the Stormer. And if you look closely, the subtitle says the German weekly for the battle for truth. This was a anti-Semitic propaganda rag. It had nothing to do with truth. This particular one says, "Was Christ a Jew?" It says the truth against lies and ignorance. Nazis didn't. A lot of Nazis were in fact Christian. They didn't know what to do with the fact that Jesus was Jewish, so they just made him Aryan or part Aryan. And so basically throw out the Old Testament. In fact, Hitler threw out anything after Paul, and so Hitler portrayed Jesus as a racial anti-Semite, which is quite a stretch. At the bottom it says the Jews are a misfortune. It's a problem we have today that legitimate news with legitimate journalists who will lose their job if they fake the news. People are calling that fake, and then they're taking their truth from rags like OANN and others that are absolutely the true fake news. So people are kind of got this inverted. So that was the point of that. One last thing that I would end with, so I'll leave some time for talking. I mentioned George Soros. This is part of a series that I put together in the wake of the bombings, the pipe bombings by a Trump supporter, far-right Trump supporter, as well as the Tree of Life synagogue killings in Pittsburgh, the largest anti-Semitic mass murder of Jews in American history. Now, starting with Caesar at the top there, he was the pipe bomb guy. I took all us from his pages before they were taken down. He was obsessed with George Soros. Again, George Soros has spent billions to support freedom, to support democracy, but the far right has turned him into some evil Jewish puppet master. So he has George Soros' organizations like Open Society Institute and Democracy Alliance, because I guess democracy is bad. And it's pointing out his Jewishness. I'm going to get a little closer to read from this. A lot of conspiracy anti-Semites pull this quote from George Soros in the upper left corner. It says, and he actually did write this. I had to do some research. He said, if ever there was a man who fit the stereotype of the Judeo-plutocratic Bolshevik socialist world conspirator, it's me. So a lot of people on the right say, oh, he's admitted what he is. if you actually look at it in context, you look at the paragraph in the book before it and the paragraph after it, what he's reflecting on is the tragic irony that he's spent his life to prevent something like Nazi Germany ever happening again, and he's being put into the myth of being a Rothschild, which was also a myth. And so what he's reflecting on is the tragic irony of everything he's done, and he's become the bogeyman. So there's a couple of here, another one here from this pipe bomber that David Hoax from the Parkland shootings was actually a con job. He was never there, and he was being paid by George Soros. There were accusations. The Trump thing was the accusation that George Soros was paying the migrants to come up from South America and Central America as part of the white replacement theory. None of that's true. The picture in the middle, a lot of anti-Semites and far-right people claim that George Soros was actually a Nazi in the SS, and that's him. That is not him. That's an actual Nazi, Oscar Groner, who did commit atrocities. Soros was actually a kid when the Nazis took over Hungary, so it's absurd. So he's become kind of this talking point. I want to end with this one. This had to do with the Tree of Life killer, Robert Bowers. Again, it's interesting where he basically, traditional anti-Semitism, this was January of 1918, Jews are the children of Satan, that John 8:44, that's been used for over 1,000 years to say that Jews are children of the devil. A lot of it's just flat out anti-Semitic, so I'm not going to read that. He refers to HIAS. HIAS was a Jewish group that's helping refugees. That's seen as being part of the conspiracy to bring in racially inferior people into white America to replace white people. That's not true. What HIAS is doing, millions of Jews died in World War II during the Holocaust because no countries would take them in, including the United States. We had enacted racist immigration laws in the 1920s. Which were used to keep Jews out of the country, and other countries did the same thing. And so he's obsessed with all of these things, and he went in and killed what they're doing. The one on the bottom right, I actually took from Ted Nugent, who's one of the craziest right-wingers I've come across. Unfortunately, the first rock concert I ever went to in a big stadium was Ted Nugent. But anyway, he posted this saying, they're coming for our guns. And he picked out all the Jewish members of Congress as well as a few others like Dershowitz and Bloomberg. And he put an Israeli flag on it. That's pure anti-Semitism. It's the kind of thing that's inculcating violence against Jews in the United States today. And I bring this up in part because of what personally happened. And I'll end with a personal story. I put this together as a PowerPoint 3 days after the Tree of Life shootings in my Holocaust class. I was clearly very disturbed by it, but I wanted to bring context to my students in the Holocaust class. And when I did this slide at the beginning of class, an older student I had started shaking, getting visibly angry, and started saying to me, "You're treading on thin ice, you're treading on thin ice." To the point where it felt very much like a physical threat against me. The next day, at the encouragement of my wife, she said, "Maybe you should Google this guy." And it turned out that he's not only a rabid Trump supporter, gun lover, and obviously a lover of Ted Nugent, but he had spent a year in jail for shooting up a bar that kicked him out. I had to have armed security the rest of the semester. He didn't know it, the class did not, but I obviously knew it. A few years before, I had to have the FBI come to my class because a local neo-Nazi group, the National Alliance, was talking about me in their chat rooms and planning some action. So I actually had undercover FBI at my class. But to kind of pull this full around, a year before this Tree of Life shooting, a colleague of mine had this slipped under her door. I'm going to show you, and I tried to scratch out the offensive word, but this was put under her door because she had pride symbols on her door. And it's a little hard to read, but it says effing F's, and that's not fascist. Effing F's and N's are destroying America. Trump lives matter. Deal with it. A white man in the White House. And then he drew a swastika and a Confederate flag. The FBI again was brought in a second time to look at this as a hate crime. But because the way Ohio hate crime law is written, since my colleague who had this under her door was a white woman, not gay, not black, it didn't apply. So nothing was done. I still had this over a year later. And when this event happened with this student, I compared the handwriting. Again, this was my wife's idea. She's pretty brilliant. But anyway, she said, do you have any of his handwriting? Because we had this note, this offensive note. And I eventually did when we had a midterm. And I compared the handwriting, and it's the exact same handwriting. It was the exact same student. So what we're seeing is that these myths, these narrative myths, and conspiratorial myths, they're myths. They're not real, but if they're believed, they can be very, very dangerous. That's a good place to stop.
Thanks, David.
All right, let's stop there. We still have 50 minutes or so.
Also, we had one question. Is it possible that nefarious actors, not necessarily from the right, are manipulating conservatives in order to weaken their position? All this seems a little too self-destructive. And I guess another way of looking at that is, is it possible that either, Russians or people from within the U.S. are just trying to steer the right in a more severe direction than they would naturally go?
Yeah.
Or do you think there's not a lot of legitimacy there?
Yeah, I agree. We do know that some of these anti-liberal, the pro-far right emails are coming from Russia or from Russian agents in other countries like Macedonia and other places, Belarus. So that is part of it. We also know in some cases, the Koch industries, Koch brothers, there's only one of them now, they've been funding some of these operations. The Blabberbuzz one, that's one of the most offensive that I found. I've only been able to trace it back to an automated email group, and it might be a guy and I found the guy's name, and he's all over LinkedIn and stuff, and he's clearly making money off. He makes money off the advertisements that are tied to these, what I would call hate mails. I don't know if he's right wing or he's just crass capitalist who's trying to make money off of something. And maybe that's part of it. But and so a lot of it I do think is external. Even when you go to something like Fox News and the New York Post and a lot of those, those are from Murdoch, who's Australian. So there are a lot of outside sources deeply affecting the American political narrative right now. And unfortunately, a lot of the people who are being swayed by a lot of this, it is essentially propaganda. I don't think they realize that. And again, one of the other things is, in my career over the last few decades, I've seen the patriot movement move from a fringe more and more to the mainstream. And now we have according to polls, 30 to 40% of Republicans believing things that it would have been like 5% just 15, 20 years ago. And I think it's because, a large part because of some of this stuff, but also because of mass media, Facebook, Twitter, all of that. There's so much misinformation. I had a statistic here. During the Black Lives Matters protest, there was also a theory that George Soros was paying for that. In May, he got 68,000 mentions in Facebook. Negative Twitter references to Soros spiked in 4 days in May during the protest from 25,000 to 500,000. So again, this is that echo chamber thing, but it's being driven by a lot of sources. And it doesn't have to be a lot of power. We know that a lot of the anti-vax material in this media, Facebook and other social media, they trace it to about 12 individuals. But people start repeating it and start posting it and pushing it forward. So you take something real little and like a virus, in this case an intellectual virus, it spreads exponentially. And so that's part of what's happening as well. But it is radicalizing our country. And I don't want to get involved. It happens on both sides, but we can't get too stuck on false equivalency. From what I'm seeing, it's far more coming from the right than the left. A lot of the anti-Antifa propaganda, Antifa means anti-fascist, so tell me why you have a problem with that. But a lot of that also is being driven as part of this narrative. Any other questions?
If I can jump
Yeah,
in,
go ahead.
that reminds me of the work that was done 100 years ago with the United Daughters of the Confederacy, where a number of people who weren't the majority of the South got together. They were mostly socialites, upper class.
Yeah.
And they put this narrative out there and got the message out there through what was available to people 100 years ago.
Yeah.
But now you have social media. Now you have all this other stuff. And it's bringing together these otherwise disparate groups,
Right.
right? Where unite the right.
Yeah.
And it's giving voice to somebody who might be like 0.2% of the American political discourse, but now they're attaching their story to this other movement. And this movement, one thing to check out is 1A, which you often hear on NPR. About a few months ago, they had something called Going Medieval on White Supremacy. And it was just like an hour and a half talk about how even the history of the Middle Ages is told in a very white supremacist way. And I just wanted to bring that up because the shaman from the Capitol insurrection just got sentenced today to 41 months. And
41 months.
he was in there wearing like what are supposedly Viking horns and all that, and that's all made up as well.
Yeah, that's part of the Nordic mythology of the far right. But he also led a Christian prayer in the Capitol itself, on the Senate floor. And that's often left out in the media. What's often left out about the American white supremacist movement is that it's largely self-proclaimed as Christian. Aryan Nations of Christ, the Christian identity movement, the Klan was profoundly Christian in their mind. That's why they're burning crosses. And now we have groups burning swastikas. It just happened this week in Austin, and another synagogue was attacked in Austin, attempted arson. And so again, these sort of narratives, these myths are exploding exponentially, and we're losing sense that they are in fact myths. Myths can be useful, they can be understanding, they create a sense of common identity and collective identity, but we have to be able to determine what's true and what's not. And that's becoming increasingly difficult for people to do, unfortunately.
Now, Jessica, if I can ask you, Jessica McLaughlin presented a couple sessions ago and talked about emotional intelligence, and then Tyler Olson followed her talking about conflict resolution. And I'm sorry I'm putting you on the spot here because I don't have an answer for this whatsoever, but if, it's one thing to argue academically between people, right? Like my telling of history is more accurate than yours in X, Y, and Z, but when you're combating somebody's narrative, that might be demonstrably false. And yes, I cracked up at the one thing you said because it was just so ludicrous. But if somebody has so deeply internalized a way of understanding the past that it's part of their identity, do you have any advice for how to even begin to talk to them in terms of emotional intelligence? And I do apologize if I put you on the spot there, because that was more what Ty Olson talked about last time. But is emotional intelligence even possible? I'll make it that simple.
Well, I mean, emotional intelligence, using those skills is always possible. I mean, I think it really depends on what your goal in the conversation is, right? Are you trying to sway someone else's opinion at all cost? Is it more important to you to preserve the relationship? You have to kind of identify where you stand, where the other person stands, and what your ultimate goal is, and also what the other person's goal is. And I think in some situations, I mean, because we've seen with these very like polarized conversations that, families and friends are getting broken up essentially, right? It's been tough. So I think there are ways to navigate these conversations in a way where we ask assertively for what it is we want or need, and that we can help point to evidence. We talked about some of those skills regarding, how to stay calm, how to engage in active listening, and making sure the other person feels heard, so that they recognize you're not just going against their argument no matter what. But I also think sometimes these conversations do take a moment can require just acceptance of, we're not always going to be able to change everyone's mind.
Yeah. Thank you.
So we had a question in the chat. How would you suggest to figure out what is true? And I'm curious to see what other feedback we get here. But Petra, I guess when it comes to history and even current events, a way that I kind of look at figuring out what is true is imagine that whatever thing you're trying to learn about is behind you. You're not actually looking at it, right? All you can do is hold like an old-fashioned hand mirror in front of you, and you can only see a little piece of it being reflected over your shoulder. So that's one news article, that's one meme, that's one Facebook post. The more angles that you look at that from, the more sources that you read, the more angles that you pursue it from, the more of the whole truth you're going to see. So, finding out truth, it takes work. It's more than just reading one article. It's more than reading from, just the thing that you're used to getting information from. So, the more of those sources that you look at and the more angles that you pursue it from, to me, that's how you get closest to actual truth. So, anybody else have thoughts on that question?
Well, I was going to say, I'm glad you said closest because, I mean, not to get way deep in philosophy here, but there is no answer key, right? What is truth when you're understanding the past? There's never going to be an answer, right? But there is better and there is worse. And so one of the things you need to do is just be honest with yourself as you're learning about the past and be comfortable with the realization that there's never going to be a complete answer. All right. And be willing to hold multiple possibilities of interpretation in your head sometimes as well. Unless you're just talking about straight up fact, right? Which is just comparing primary sources to primary sources. Petra? Hope you're muted.
Yes, I mean, I live in a family where you have, as Jessica was making comment about, there's friends don't talk to friends. We avoid conversations with other family members because all they do is get angry. I mean, that you can't just talk. But when I'm talking about, truth, yeah, individual truth is only as complex as the data they look at. And it's the idea of trying to somehow get anybody out there to somehow get them to teach them to that everything they read isn't necessarily the truth, and to do what you just said, to look at it. And I do like that analogy about holding a mirror in front of you. That is awesome for research. Since I tutor here, I'm going to use it if you don't mind.
Way to show us up, John.
But it's the idea of how to get this idea that you actually have to search for what is true across to loads of people.
Yep.
And I think I have a thought that maybe then I would throw to you is I just lost it. I just turned 40 this year and it's already happening. But
I just turned 60, so.
Yeah. Does it get better?
No.
Does it get better?
No.
Don't even go there.
This whole narrative way of being a human and seeing everything around you that makes people characters, right? And I noticed like Marjorie Taylor Greene brought up Hitler and Satan at the same time. And that's something I've noticed in the big swipe of history, that in older Western history, like in conversation, there'd be references to an ultimate evil. It'd be Satan, it'd be Lucifer, or it'd be Pharaoh, like the politician who's allowing evil. And since World War II, it seems to be Hitler and Nazi has taken that place where you're being a Hitler, you're being a Nazi. And then by extension, now in a lot of the political discourse, you just have liberal thrown out there with no meaning, or worse, that I'm not going to say out loud, variations of the word liberal, right? And I think the difficulty, and I don't know how to handle this, is that is then making a world where half of the characters in it are enemies.
Right.
And I don't know how you have a conversation like we're having with somebody who from the get-go is seeing you as an enemy.
And especially an evil enemy.
Yeah.
In these emails that I've been collecting, there was the one that keeps getting repeated. It says, evil liberals force Walmart to do something. Well, say someone's evil right there. You've already demonized them. You're not going to have any kind of constructive dialogue. And actually, if you click on the thing, it's Walmart pulling back on guns because they had a mass shooting in one of their stores. It has nothing to do with good and evil in that sense, other than the evil of the shooter committed the crime. But it's not evil liberals behind it. We need to take evil out of the equation, because if you don't, that's when people start getting shot. that's when you start seeing the mass shootings. And the reality is we've seen much more mass shootings by people on the far right than the far left. It's simply a fact. And so we can't fall into some false equivalency, point to one thing that happened here and say that's the same as 3,000 over here, because it's not. And so again, coming back to truth, facts matter. Facts matter. And we need to verify facts. Finding truth should be hard. It just should. So take the effort. Anybody else?
Yes, I have a question about echo chambers. So I'm currently doing my thesis on the Southern Lost Cause and the Dawn of
Adam
the-
Smith, former History Club president, now at Stanford.
Hello.
Oh, Adam, hi.
How are you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Just getting over COVID.
Oh.
It's been wonderful.
All right. Well, I'll send you an email there. We can see how you're doing.
So I was looking at echo chambers and how they create radicalization, and then almost to the point of cult-like groups.
Oh yeah.
Now with the alt-right, you see them preying on individuals that are usually seeking something in society in themselves. So, if we look at these individuals that's been radicalized as being more in a cult because they usually surround themselves with religious ideology, usually myths around like Nordic or like white supremacy ideology, would that be a better way to then try to I don't want to use the word educate them, but show them like proper primary sources, because otherwise they get angry and they get scared because they have been indoctrinated into a belief system that is their family, it is their community, and you're trying to remove them from that, and you see anger because their reality of what they believe is then being attacked. So how do we navigate that, knowing that these are individuals that have been indoctrinated into a cult type setting?
Well, I think that's a good analogy, because in a sense with people who get, and I've known people who got sucked into various kinds of cults, the idea is you want to try to deprogram them, but they're going to be resistant to that. They're going to be really resistant to that. So it's very hard to do that. We need to have a dialogue. We need to try to bring up facts and sources. They're probably usually going to give up fake facts and fake sources. So you have to try to point that out. But I don't really have an answer for this. I often in my Holocaust class in the past, I've had alt-right students, and I treat them exactly the same. And if they come up with something, if they can back it up with facts, they usually can't, we'll talk about it. But if they can't, and usually by the end of the semester, they're either very quiet or they're not quite as gung-ho as they were, or they didn't change at all. And all I can do is say, this is the real history. This is the real truth. But in the end, it's the individual who's going to have to start making those choices. If you're being led towards violence, you could just take that as an indicator of you're on the wrong path. I'll follow Gandhi on that one. So, and Martin Luther King.
I think you raise a really important point there, that sometimes people think if they're arguing with somebody who's holding maybe a racist thought or an anti-Semitic thought, you focus on that and try to get them to change that one thought. But a person's worldview is so incredibly interconnected. There's so many pieces to it, and it's not just intellectual. It is at the emotional level. It's at the psychological level. And like you said, Adam, it also brings in friends, people that you might now see as your family. And to question even one part of that tangled web loosens the entire web. And people instantly pull back from that and get defensive because it's their core being. So maybe recognizing that can help, but also we don't have the energy to just focus on everybody who needs our help like that sometimes. So I will say I've become a fan. I probably have about 600 blocked people on Facebook now. So, sometimes you need to do that as well.
I just ignore it entirely.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Adam. I'm glad you're doing well. We're technically over time, but anybody who wants to keep chatting, I can be.
Yeah, we have the room. No one's coming in here.
Leo,
And
I know. Oh, Leo just left. I was just going to put him on the spot. Good work, Leo.
And before we lose people, One other question that I had for the group, since I know we've got a lot of folks who have attended more than one of these, are there workshops that could fall under the Stand for Racial Justice umbrella that you would like to see done in the future? Are there other topics besides what we've carried out so far that you think would be good for investigation? You know, this is also an opportunity for you to share that, so, you know, we could plan future stuff.
And I just received word that we'll be able to get some sort of website put together for navigating a polarized world that'll hold the videos that we've taken of all these sessions, as well as any materials that other people upload. And we can absolutely expand it, like John said. So, anything else you'd like to hear people talk about?
So I was just thinking, like, with what we were saying recently, it seems like a lot of what we're talking about connects to like implicit biases.
Mhm.
So that might be an interesting one.
Just a bias-focused workshop. That sounds great. You want to volunteer?
I can talk a little bit about implicit biases.
Oh, you know what? I can
But,
stop the recording at this point since we're all just sort of chit-chatting now.
And Matt, we did have a question. Can we see the videos of previous sessions before the website is up?
I can look, but I don't know where they would be hosted at this point until we get that website. But if I'm able to share them, I have them all in my WebEx account. And so I don't know, John or Jessica, if you know that if professors can share links straight from their own WebEx accounts.
I don't think you can do it straight from your WebEx account. You can upload it on Media Site, which is pretty easy to do. And if you upload the video to Media Site, then you can send out the Media Site link to anyone.
So if you want to find out where we host these things, put your name and email address in the comments. And then once I know, I'll let you know immediately where they're going to be available at. And Jessica, I know our session, we were worried about the technology, or your session, I should say. It did record. It did record. So we do have all four.
Had a comment that the discussions have been incredibly interesting and thought-provoking. So good to know we're off to a good start here. And yeah, I mean, whether it's stuff like implicit bias or, you know, things like white fragility, I mean, there are still other challenging, difficult conversations to have that fall under racial justice. So, you know, I know that we certainly haven't tackled every topic out there. But again, I certainly appreciate everyone who has attended any of these workshops and, you know, all of your thoughts and comments and questions, things like that. So, you know, hopefully as we build more of these things, we'll keep seeing you.
It's also been nice for me to see students I have from online classes that I haven't gotten to interact before. So hi, Mariona, Morale, Inez, Garrett. Yeah, it's great to see everybody attend.
Hey, so new question. When in history have societies been so polarized?
Civil War.
Since when? Or
Since when? It's an interesting question because part of me as a historian always go, like when people say this is worse than it's ever been. And I'm like, there was a civil war. There was a revolution. There was this, there was that. It's a different kind of division because it's less regional. It's falling along different lines, because, at least I think, because the technology is out there to allow you to really create what I call, elsewhere I've taught anthropology, and basically we create our own digital tribes now, where I think Derek last time was saying, like, you know, you grow up in an area and that's your hometown, and those are the people you interact with, period. But nowadays, you can ignore everybody you see in the hallway. You can not know about most of your neighbors and just interact with people that you want to interact with. And that means the echo chamber is a lot stronger than probably it's been.
yeah, I mean, in the past, it was an us and them that was based on geography often.
Yeah.
Who's on the other side of the mountain range? Who's on the other side of the river, the pond, the ocean, or whatever? And we created a sense of us versus them, language based on language and religion and ethnicity, skin tone, whatever.
Mhm.
But now, as you say, with this digital tribalism, it's creating a whole other area of division. You know, it's uniting small groups against other small groups.
And I do think that's giving an outside voice to, like you said, these marginal, I'm going to use the judgmental word, but these marginal crazy groups that really wouldn't have had their ideas reach that wide of an audience. Like you'd be like, oh, here's my crazy friend who believes this crazy stuff. Isn't he weird? But you still like to hang out with him. But now he can be part of a community that is like-minded and they spread their ideas. It's
Well, yeah,
almost like minority party politics in
and
Europe.
that's one of the reasons we've seen the anti-vax go from a minority group to a much bigger group. The flat earthers. I mean, I'm talking about stupid ideas. There's millions of people who are following that purely because of social media. So again, things that you really had to go out of your way to get into flat earth thinking or even anti-vax thinking. And now it's just a click away.
Yeah,
So
one we just had a question: do we think that COVID made the polarization worse? And I mean, I certainly think it was one more touch point for people to rally around.
I think Derek last time said that the main prediction was that going through a shared negative experience would make us more connected because we see that oftentimes in history, but that the opposite happens.
Yeah.
Well, it's almost like it made two groups more interconnected. Like, I think that it probably helped solidify the pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine groups more than they had in the past.
Yeah.
As far as uniting us as a country,
maybe I don't know. I'm just spitballing here, but because we went even more digital, we were all like the person on the computer in the basement all day long. You know, so
yeah, that's your phone. So
yeah.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, to me, one of the scariest groups out there are the people who wouldn't have had much solidarity in their own community, but now find it, and that's the incel movement.
Right.
You know, where it's like, okay, here's a troubled person, but he's a loner, but now he's finding a community of 1,000 other people reinforcing those ideas.
Yeah, and unfortunately, reinforcing those ideas then can radicalize people into violent acts.
Yeah.
Because they feel like a lot of these people, mass shooters in New Zealand and Bowers in Pittsburgh, they're filming their mass shootings to hopefully get other people to do the same thing. So they're trying to use this live streaming media to essentially create a revolution, violent, either anti-Islamic, anti-Semitic, or anti-liberal, or whatever it might be. And so we're seeing a big uptick in that kind of myth-induced violence, I'll call it.
I like that.
Yeah.
Now,
Let's write a book.
I just came up with that.
now with media being able to cause such great devastation within a society so fast, do you see some type of restrictions coming down from the federal government, even with support with, say, like an amendment, that kind of controls destructive propaganda? Because now it's getting to a point like you just stated, like even the incel movement, we see being radicalized and weaponized in a very, which I think is a very dangerous sect of society, because these are individuals that have come to the conclusion that their future for reproduction is lost, and now they need to make an impact in society to be remembered.
And what we often miss is that as much as we focus on racial violence, anti-Semitic violence, that depending on how you're looking at the numbers, a lot of times it's sexism-based violence trumping the other forms. So.
Right.
But your question was,
Well,
do you see a federal?
And I think there is a movement to try to create more federal oversight. I mean, now it's been encouraging Facebook to take down misleading material. You know, Zuckerberg said that he lied, actually committed contempt of Congress because he lied, said that his Facebook had removed 90% of the untruths, and their Facebook's own internal, this was the whistleblower, own internal memo said they'd only done 5%. And so Twitter, all of they need to, you know, we want them to self-police, but that largely doesn't work. That's why we need federal regulations on pollution, guns, all kinds of things, because you can't just expect people to act well and corporations to do what's best for the community. It's that's a neoliberal fantasy. And so we need actually more legislation.
Now with that, do you think like self-policing within the tech companies on, you know, the slowing down destructive propaganda? Now, do you think the internet, well, the access to the internet or the internet itself is just too big to where the federal government would actually have to help due to the logistics and the manpower of look how much money Facebook spent just containing say 5%. Because these are corporations that need to make profit. They do have profit holders. So like, should the government subsidize them and their help to control dangerous propaganda? That way they actually have the workforce to actually go through these posts and then censor misleading or dangerous information.
It just seems like it's a giant game of whack-a-mole.
Yeah, I mean, it is really difficult. I mean, these are geniuses with algorithms, so why can't they create an algorithm that could really actually target misinformation and hate?
Yeah.
And actually do the job of doing it. I think they can do it, but as Adam, you said, they're actually profiting off of misinformation.
Yeah.
They're profiting off of hate. And so that's when the government does need to stand in, because corporations rarely take it upon themselves. There are a lot of neoliberals, for instance, who say, oh, we don't need all these pollution regulations because it costs too much money. Corporations will just do it themselves. Well, that's nonsense. They've never done that, and they never will do that. So, unfortunately, part of the neoliberal revolution since the late 70s, the Reagan Revolution, Conservative Revolution, has been to deregulate everything and to privatize everything, including education, et cetera, and assume that individuals will be moral, competent actors who will only do what's good. I mean, that's just not going to happen. That's never been the case. But they've demonized the federal government as big brother. Like this whole deep state fantasy. There is no deep state, especially a liberal deep state. If there was a liberal deep state, we never would have had Trump. So, I mean, it's just nonsense. But people believe that's another fake myth narrative of the deep state.
I mean, the tricky thing, the internet, its history, it was constructed as basically like a libertarian's tech dream. It is so incredibly decentralized, which is in a lot of ways a strength of it, because it's very hard for any government to really manipulate it. But then it also ends up being, part of the trickiness with this situation. I'm just trying to look back on precedents within U.S. law to do anything rather than creating something totally new. And we didn't get to discuss it last time, but we mentioned trust busting laws, like the Sherman Act of maybe breaking up the big companies. And something else I'm thinking is there is a federal history of noting that certain aspects of American society are part of the public space. So roads, the atmosphere, waterways, and I mean, I'm just thinking this new right now, but it seems like there should be a strengthened concept of a digital public space. I know it's sort of there already but like net neutrality has been under attack. But it almost seems like there needs to be a whole amendment package that's just the digital amendment.
Yeah, perhaps.
Yeah. The thing is, once we write that, there's just going to be a new development in the science and the tech. We fixed the world. No, we didn't.
Yeah, darn.
Yeah.
And Garrett mentioned, I think social media is part of the way things sway.
Yeah, people get their ideas, their beliefs, they form biases through social media. It is a driving factor in the modern world. For the good, the bad. We've seen people eating Tide Pods. Like, what the? Like, why? Like they're literally burning their stomachs. Oh God, they were literally they were literally burning their stomachs out of their body, but because it was trendy, hey, why not?
Yeah. I just become profoundly uncomfortable with the idea of regulating social media posts, because there's that whole slippery slope thing. There's completely false information on there, but then going back to that media bias fact chart, which is basically just this wonderful bell curve. You've got things on the far right and the far left that may not necessarily be false information, but they intentionally leave out true information that benefits them. So, like, where do you draw the line on what gets removed or censored? Is it the
because
stuff
that should be part of the human experience,
or is it just garbage? Like, yeah.
Well, I think part of the solution is just start teaching media literacy from primary school on. every semester,
Yeah.
all the time. So they know how to say, well, this is suspicious, this is strange, this is weird.
That's liberal brainwashing now.
Well,
Isn't
that's
that how it's going to be seen?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's part of the.
I'm trying not to be cynical, but
That's my world.
I haven't been getting oxygen for the past hour and a half.
I study Nazi Germany. You have to be cynical.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that really does make a good point. Given society the tools at an earlier age of critical thinking.
Yeah.
That way they could be able to analyze something, see, question it as they're analyzing it. Which I think, me personally, I don't think our middle school, high school education really gives the tools for critical thinking. There's many reasons for that. Everything from economics to inequalities to even the school district itself, because everything's so decentralized. Look how hard it was just to get like mandates for disease prevention in schools during COVID, because every school district charters their own pathway for the most part.
I think that's the big riddle of the modern world, is that the scope of everything is so big that individualism or regionalism, being decentralized, any of that kind of stuff's just, no matter what virtue you find in it, it's just almost impossible when there's a crisis, whether it's a political crisis or a climate crisis. Yeah. Well, I'm ready to go outside and take my mask off. I'm so happy everybody showed up. Thank you for handling me, putting you on the spot, Jessica. John, always a pleasure.
Ever your servant.
And Adam, I missed you.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know you had the.
Yeah, I was in my Holocaust during COVID.
Oh wow.
My best COVID student.
Oh really?
Yeah.
Yeah. The what is it? COVID over here isn't bad. It just, we were having a transfer party, and the person I was sitting next to got COVID like 3 days prior. And then they had like sniffles, but they didn't tell anyone, and so then I got blasted with it. So I'm like probably a good week behind on all my coursework right now. Like I literally was just laying in bed all last week, and I have like probably like 25 pages to write. And then, but everything's been good. Like medical care, all that. It definitely was not a fun virus too, and I was vaccinated too.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm still within like that 6-month window from the last shot, and it put me on my fucking ass.
Like, oh my god!
Like I was not a happy person.
So I'm glad you sound okay now.
Oh yeah, you should have heard me.
Yeah,
you should have heard me last week. I could barely even talk, and we all know how I love to talk.
I thought the world seemed different for a while.
A little more quiet.
It's like one powerful voice was suddenly silenced.
Now, what, like historically looking at the Lost Cause movement, what can we learn from that and try to extrapolate those lessons in the technology side of misinformation?
It's a good question. I mean, one subtopic of this that isn't new to any of us, but it's the influence that certain lobbying groups can have on history textbooks because of the way that whole system works. I don't know if that's the first example in American history of a really strong impact on what's put in history textbooks, but it's definitely a really prominent example of it. Yeah. And unfortunately was a lesson then provided to later generations of people who want to sway things as well.
Yeah, because like we were in the classroom this week. I'm taking a American slavery class here, and then we were actually talking a little bit about the Lost Cause, and then it's probably what the professor deemed probably the first time in history you see the losing side of a war be able to then control the narrative solely due to how decentralized America is.
Yeah.
Regional control, local control, state constitutions. Now if they couldn't stop it then, like you said, like what do we actually have to look at? Well, maybe being so decentralized is actually dangerous to a American society. Because now we got information we literally cannot control.
I don't know if we can reduce it between centralized and decentralized, because then you also have the centralization of like a statewide board of education. I mean, my pipe dream is that academic freedom would truly be held at all levels of education.
Yeah.
But I mean, much of the general public wants, to some degree, the teaching of American history to be about narrative and myth and values.
Well,
and
makes
then they
sense
play the whole
because
taxpayer argument. So, what's that, Adam?
Yeah, well, yeah, it makes sense because it's a form of nation building. It unifies a idea of a of a common mythology when you have a agenda-based narrative for nation building.
And that's why critical race theory is such a powerful discourse right now. So, I mean, that's the problem with all of these workshops we've done, is that we're good at presenting the issues, and then it's like, okay, what are solutions? And it's tricky. I feel like I want to pick your brain more on this later, because I don't know if you're probably burned out at this point, but having the historical perspective of seeing a society that's gone through fascism, and not that they're a perfect German utopia now, but they've had a historical evolution through a overtly fascist phase, but then into other things. Of course, it took the bombing of Dresden and who knows.
Well, yeah, and the other, when you see all these references about Gestapo tactics, that's a myth a lot of people have, is that the Nazis just cowered the people through fear and terror to be compliant, and that's not true. The vast majority of Germans supported Hitler and the Nazis. And so, and that's one of the reasons the Holocaust happened. And so people bought into the myths, and they bought into all the emotions and the passions, and fully accepted it. And so, and when you see polls saying 40% of Republicans think the election is stolen, even though there's absolutely no facts whatsoever, that scares, that as a historian of Nazi Germany, that scares the hell out of me. And that's why I say, people believing things that are fringe or stupid, if there's enough of people who believe it, people die.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, during the Weimar period in Germany, you had that stab in the back narrative going on.
Yeah, I was actually going to have a slide. I was going to do that. Tie it to the the Rothschild, Soros, stab in the back myth. In fact,
even the politicians, gave up our country, and we would have won if we just would have persevered.
Well, exactly. In fact, the quote I used from that Mo Brooks used was in reference to that. If you look at the full quote, Hitler was referring to newspapers saying that it wasn't the Social Democrats and it wasn't the Home Front that lost the war. It was the generals, especially referring to Ludendorff, who was a friend of Hitler's at the time. And so then that's when Hitler went off on the lying press, the fake news, and the Jews are behind it all. And then came up with this stab in the back myth that it was the socialists, the Jews, the liberals, they're the ones who stabbed us in the back narrative. And then we see what happens after that. And I've been telling my students for 4 or 5 years now that we in much of the world, are in our Weimar moment. We're in our Weimar moment, and we're failing.
Yep. I thought of that when Biden ended up being the Democrat who came through the primaries, because it just sort of seemed like that consensus figure, but
consensus, but not beloved.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was going for there.
Yeah.
Consensus, but not beloved, not with cheering throngs, uniting people. It's just he's the best we can do to unite everybody who's not that. Right. Yeah.
Well, if you look at a group like Black Lives Matter through the lens of this, this is our stab in the back moment in history. It's very easy to see how people on the right can point at Black Lives Matter and go, look, they're anti-law and order, and just completely ignore their actual message.
Oh,
yeah. Yeah, and that brings up a good point on even media and how like just being selective. Like, there'll be a Black Lives Matter protest. They'll burn some cars. The people that usually run the protests actually do publicly apologize for what happened, but they also have no control over it. But you never see them apologize on the news or in the media or on Facebook. That part of the event isn't played. So then you get the right wing thinking, well, they just don't care. They're allowing this anarchy to happen. But in reality, no. Like the people that actually got the permits for the protest did actually apologize for what happened. But they actually have no authority to stop what happened either.
Well, it's true. And anytime you have mass demonstrations, there's going to be a certain segment of society who's not even really involved in the demonstration, they're just taking advantage of it to loot and create violence.
Exactly.
And we also know that when some of the violence and looting was happening, like in Chicago, the police actually were just sitting in a liberal politician's room making popcorn. They deliberately were trying to make a point and not enforcing the law.
Yeah.
If the police had been enforcing the law rather than getting in military gear to just in case Black Lives Matter erupts into something, that was part of the reason as well. I mean, so that's part of the issue as well.
There's an interesting dynamic where that can be turned into strategy that you see somewhat in the latter stage of the women's suffrage movement in the United States, where you have the older generation of upper middle class women who would talk about suffrage and not get listened to. And then you get Alice Paul and the National Women's Party who start burning shit in front of the White House.
Yeah.
And then that's the same dynamics really picked up on in the 60s with the Black rights movement of like when King and the other people working with him would come to Chicago, they would acknowledge that there's also this Black Power movement out there and play into the tropes that it's pro-violence rather than self-defense and all that, and say to like Mayor Daley in Chicago, like, okay, here are our rational demands. If you don't acquiesce to those, then we can't stop those people either. Hint, hint. All right. So there can be strategy in that dynamic, which I always find fascinating.
All right, well, there was our extended pause. I'll use that as my opportunity to bow out. But folks, it was a pleasure.
Yeah. And I'm glad you get to talk about history because in another life he's a historian.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
All right, take care.
Yeah.
This is great.
All right, guys.